I want to talk about something today which is very often much undervalued and yet which has tremendous potential if only we can harness it in the right way. Unfortunately, often these are handled in a totally damaging way instead. But first, I want to ask you a question. When something goes wrong in your organization, someone makes a mistake, or there are serious complaints about something, what question gets asked? Is it, who's to blame? Whose fault is this? Does something going wrong seem to result in a witch hunt for a scapegoat as the first thing? If so, you may be living in a blame culture. I used to like to ask this question when I went into organizations back in the days when I was working, and ask if they have a blame culture. I asked, do you know what I mean by a blame culture? And one guy replied, I don't know, but if we do, it's his fault. At another organization, I was giving a foundation course for the testers and their managers, good for them, and I asked this question, do you have a blame culture? And the managers, sitting in the front row, all shook their heads no, and the testers in the back row were nodding their heads yes. Interesting. One final example, one guy, when I asked, do you have a blame culture? He said, no, we don't have a blame culture, we have a revenge culture. Does this sound familiar? Why are we so quick to try to pin the blame, preferably on somebody else? You've heard the phrase, to err is human, but to blame somebody else is even more human. Remember Bart Simpson? I didn't do it, nobody saw me do it, you can't prove anything. Perhaps we rationalize that by pinpointing the blame, the desired effect will be an improvement from the person who made the mistake. However, it's usually the opposite. The actual effect of blame is guilt and an attempt to hide the truth. I believe that blame is a misguided attempt to get people to accept responsibility. But responsibility only grows when it's okay to make mistakes. Mistakes are a part of life. Everyone makes mistakes and errors because we don't live in a perfect world. We don't work for a perfect organization. And we are not perfect either. Another thing is that errors, mistakes, are a byproduct of creativity. If you are doing something new for the first time, how can you possibly know the best way to do it? We learn by experimenting. In other words, we learn by making mistakes. Failure is the fastest route to success. So, are mistakes wrong? What a silly question. Of course, mistakes are not the correct thing to do, but they are only wrong in the light of later knowledge. We don't know they're wrong when we're making the mistake. We don't think to ourselves, let's see, there are usually 5 errors in this feature and I've only put 3 in so far, so I better put a couple more in? Of course not. So they're not intentional. Mistakes are not wrong in a moral sense. They're not sinful. There's a great book which contrasts the way that the medical profession and the aviation profession deal with mistakes. It's called Black Box Thinking by Matthew Syed. Did you know that more people are killed by preventable medical mistakes than by traffic accidents in the US? Because in the medical profession, they hide mistakes rather than learn from them. It's a blame culture. It's the same in this country. But the aviation industry learns from its mistakes. They investigate every error that occurs. They look at them in great detail, and it makes air travel safer for all of us. There's another great book that I really like called Mistakes Were Made, But Not By Me, by Carol Tavris and Elliot Aronson. They explain why we delude ourselves in frightening ways to avoid accepting blame, accepting responsibility for our own mistakes. So I suggest that mistakes are actually one of the most valuable assets you can have, provided that you deal with them in the right way. There's a bit more information and a good example in test automation in the pattern Learn from Mistakes, which you can find in our wiki, testautomationpatterns.org. So if you don't want a blame culture, what can you do? What's the opposite of blame? I believe there are two things. The opposite of a blame culture is both a learning culture and a forgiving culture. In a learning culture, it's okay to make a mistake. The attitude is, yes, a mistake was made. Now let's see what we can learn from it so that we do better next time. This is an opportunity to understand what went wrong. The thing is, it's never just the individual. Although the mistake was made by an individual, it was made in the context of the organization, the culture, other people. All of these are contributing factors to the mistake being made. The person who made it was just unfortunately in the wrong place at the wrong time. Anyone in a similar context would probably have made the same mistake. Of course, making the same mistake more than once might not be a good idea, so always try to make new ones. But the antidote to a blame culture is also a forgiving culture. It's not necessarily forgetting, otherwise there's no learning. But basically, the slate is wiped clean. You have been given a pardon. You no longer have to serve time for whatever you did. This means that we can now leave it behind and move on, so it doesn't continually infect the now. By the way, forgiving is definitely not the easy option. You may have discovered this yourself. Blame is much more innate to the human psyche. And we also need to forgive ourselves. We can accept responsibility for messing up, but know that it isn't fatal. We can let it go, and we can learn from it so that we avoid it next time. And it still means we are doing a good job. Making a mistake does not mean you're doing a bad job. So I would like to suggest that we look at mistakes as positive learning opportunities. Next time something goes wrong, stop yourself from saying, "Whose fault is this?" and instead ask, what can we all learn from this?